Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, a spiritual approach to retirement, with our guests, Barbara Radke and Bill Miller. My name is Dan Smart. I'm the associate publisher here at 23rd Publications, a division of Bayard. As I said, we will be recording. We will have this presentation available in a video form on YouTube. Also, I just wanted to point out today, as we have the webinar gets going, if you have any questions or comments, as Bill and Barbara and Kathy share, please feel free to post those in the chat, and we will try to address those as best we can during the presentation. And without further ado, I want to introduce today's moderator for the webinar, introduce my friend and colleague, Kathy Hendricks, who is the acquisitions editor for 23rd Publications, and she's a speaker and an author of several books. Just to say, Kathy's most recent book is called Grace in the Wound, Finding Hope in Long-Term Grief, a beautiful book. As all Kathy's books are beautiful. Anyway, Kathy, I will turn the mic over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan, and welcome to all of you. We've been eager to have this webinar for quite a while because Barbara and Bill have both done such a beautiful job addressing this topic of retirement. So we want to start with a reflection, and we're going to draw upon another one of Bayard's resources, and we're happy to have the author of this on the webinar today, Sister Janet Scheffler, who wrote this lovely book, Let This Be the Time, Spiritual Essentials for Life's Second Act. And we thought we would share this reflection from your Janet's book. And Janet, thank you for writing this and for, once again, offering us such a wonderful spiritual insight. And while it's not exactly a prayer, it's something to really, I think, reflect upon as we move into our topic today of a spiritual approach to retirement. As Sister Janet writes, it is not that spirituality is a component that will help us make the most out of aging. It's that aging is a spiritual path in and of itself. Aging itself is a sacred pilgrimage, a holy way. The aging journey is a fresh and deepened way of experiencing God's love and presence. There's so much to just kind of draw upon there and reflect upon, and particularly to kind of form a focus for our conversation today, because both Barbara and Bill have certainly taken this into their hearts. This is really kind of a driving force in their writing, in their materials. So I want to welcome both of them and just introduce them. Dr. Barbara Radke, dear friend, she and I have known each other for many, many, many years. Barbara is a retired educator, and during her career that spanned 5 decades, she has been a parish director of religious education and a catechist in every grade level K through 12, which right there is quite an accomplishment, Barbara. As an administrator, an instructional designer, and teacher in higher education, she created online adult faith formation resources and helped prepare women and men for full-time ministry. She still teaches an occasional graduate course for Boston College Clow. How do you pronounce that?
Clow. Mm-hmm.
School of Theology and Ministry. Barbara was raised in a family of 5 children and is a widow after 28 years of marriage. She has always called somewhere in the Northeast corridor of the U.S. home. She engages with members of a large extended family who live throughout the U.S., and she loves being an aunt, a great aunt, and a godmother. And that forms a lot of your work And our conversation, certainly.
It does.
So thank you, Barbara, for joining us. And now I want to introduce Bill Miller, who's a former secretary for catechesis for the Diocese of Cleveland. He's also a past president of the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. He holds a master's degree in religious education and a certificate in spiritual direction. And I so relate to that, Bill, because I'm also a spiritual director, and I know that has formed so much of a basis for your work. He is the author of Finding Your Spiritual Direction as a Catechist, which has been a bestseller for 23rd Publications, and A Time of Blessings and Peace, also published by 23rd. He is co-author of Digital Ministry and Leadership in Today's Church, which is published by Liturgical Press. Bill has given retreats and presentations regionally, nationally, and internationally. He and his wife, 45 years, congratulations. He and Marilyn live in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. And in a little bit, I'll be sharing contact information for both Barbara and Bill, their websites, their emails, so that you'll be able to contact them if you have any questions after the presentation. But as Dan said earlier, be sure to post any questions in your chat box, and I'll be monitoring that as we move into our conversation. So Bill, welcome. Barbara, welcome. And I want to give each of them a chance to talk a little bit about their books. So Bill, I'm going to start with you and invite you to, I'll just put this up here, to share a little bit about your book, A Time of Blessings and Peace. 30 mini retreats to celebrate the retirement years. So I'll give you a chance here to talk about that.
Thank you, Kathy. And again, welcome everyone. It's great to be with you today through this wonderful means of technology that we have. And I'm delighted to be a part of this whole panel. The book that I wrote, which actually was published last September, is actually, I like to call it a spiritual resource, if you will. As you see, the subtitle is 30 mini retreats to celebrate the retirement years. And the way the book is structured, I've broken it up into 3 major divisions, if you will, each one taking about a third of the book. So the first division is on prayer, and it's really designed. I have 10 short essays there that are designed to expand people's notion of what prayer is, how you can pray with using all different kinds of techniques. I give examples. I tell some stories about that. And some of the topics that I cover in that first section are seeing God in all things, that very Ignatian principle from St. Ignatius. I also talk about trust and surrender, and even reference a little bit about the whole the anonymous movement, like Al-Anon and all of the different kind, because that's where this whole surrender principle is really highlighted. And they've done such a great job of forming an important theological component around that idea of surrendering to that higher power. In that first section, I also talk about having an attitude of gratitude and how important it is to pray prayers of gratitude, prayers of thanksgiving, not only prayers of petition, as important as those are, but also looking at other ways to pray, as I said, gratitude and doing other things with prayers of praise and glory to God, that kind of thing. And then another part of another one of those, the 10 things that I cover in that section is on rededicating your life to God. And you can do that daily, weekly. You can do it as many times as you want. And I kind of recommend doing it the more often, the better, just taking an opportunity to rededicate your life to God. So I talk a little bit about that. The second section of the book is about being open to change. And, in our retirement years, or as we approach our retirement years, we're looking at a whole lot of change in our lives. even if we're maybe just moving into semi-retirement, if we can't maybe afford to move completely into retirement. But there's still going to be a lot of change, a lot of things happening. There's going to be some of that change is going to be easier and some is going to be more difficult. There's going to be some grieving involved. There's going to be also opportunities to look at new possibilities. So I talk in that section about things like humility. I talk about embracing joy, which is very important. I talk about the concept of playfulness. Playfulness is such an important part of life, and sometimes it doesn't get its due. So I spend one of my essays talking about playfulness. And then also another one of those very significant principles that comes up in Alcoholics Anonymous, the whole anonymous movement, is the idea of detachment. It's an important psychological principle which really has a lot to do with how we manage life, and also especially as we move towards moving on to the next life. How do we learn detachment? Important aspects of that. And also I talk in that particular segment of the book, I talk about creativity. And then the final section of the book, the final third, if you will, I talk about relationship building. And relationship building in this sense talks about, it's about the whole concept of building our relationship with God. Also, we do that oftentimes by building our relationship or nurturing our relationship with other people and with our own spirits, and acknowledging the presence of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, living within us, and how we really encourage that and nurture that. And so in that section, I talk about things like holy listening. That's one of my favorite topics to talk about, and that is highlighted in that last section. Learning even more how to be a good listener, not just to other people, as important as that is, but also being a holy listener with regard to how we listen to the Lord's voice in our lives. And then I also talk about the importance of such things as storytelling, both telling our stories and listening to other people's stories, and how those really generate more passion in our own lives. And also I talk about one of the things that comes up often, especially in this time of life, which is the concept of forgiveness. Are there relationships that are broken, or at least cracked, if you will, disfigured in some way, that we would like to try and work on nurturing, making those better in some way? And also the very significant aspect of mentoring, and how mentoring, which is something that we could do various times in our life, but how it becomes particularly significant as we are in this retirement stage of life, so to speak. So that's a little bit about my book right there, Kathy, a little introduction. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Bill. It's just a beautiful book, and I love the, you know, when you look at your subtitle, to celebrate the retirement years, there's much that you're speaking about that is celebratory of around this time. So thank you. Barbara, I'll turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, Entering the Next Stage with Grace, A Spiritual Approach to Retiring?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to be here. And Bill, thanks for that overview of your book. I have used it and have enjoyed it. And I have also, it's dovetailed with a lot of my ideas also. So I'm looking forward to when we have a chance to converse. Well, to tell you a little bit about this book, it's really a booklet. I'd like to tell you first how I sort of got started with this. When I was getting closer to retirement, my interest grew in listening to people who were getting ready to retire and who had just recently retired, maybe a year or so. And what I was hearing was that there was lots of support for the financial aspect of retirement, but little else. And that people had concerns, maybe even worries, as well as anticipations of what they would do with their time. And so I started to think that maybe there needed to be some kind of tool for people when they were thinking about retirement or just retiring. And so this this booklet is really good for that time of life. Or also, now what I've learned is that retirement has different stages to it. And when you feel you're moving into a different stage of retirement, like maybe it's a good time to look back and re-examine. Maybe this will help again. So one of the things I was able to do through the Boston College's Cloud School of Theology and Ministry, where I was working full-time at the time, was they gave me the time and space to interview people. So I interviewed about 30 people who were willing to share their concerns and anticipate the challenges and joys. And about half of them were folks who were anticipating retirement, and the other half had been retired less than 5 years. And out of that, as an instructional designer, I built an online course for people to process this discernment, maybe with some other people if they wanted to do this. And then from that course came entering the next stage with grace, the little booklet. So to tell you a little bit more about what is actually in the booklet, it also has 3 parts. And I looked at some very practical things, but tried to make sense of them in terms of God being present to it, to us, and helping open up with grace an idea of how we would embrace the change that comes with it, with these items or agendas that we were meeting. This change, as Bill talked about. And so one of the things one of the sections I did look at was structuring time. And another section was renewing meaning and purpose. And then I also did look at money. I looked at finances in relationship to possessions and place, but more to situate those topics in terms of who we were and what God was asking of us in this time, who we could be in this time, and to anticipate the kind of grace that would come, that we would be able to deal with any unknown that would come up in this area. Because it seemed to me from the interviews, this is where people felt pretty insecure. So in each of these sections, what I do is I start with a little narrative that someone shared with me, either formally or informally. For example, when I talk about time, I start out with telling the story of a former corporate executive who offered to me a very amusing and helpful insight that we really need to be self-compassionate about scheduling unrestricted time, because by the time that we are retiring, we have had multiple decades of people scheduling our lives for us. And what really made me laugh is he said, I've had a schedule since preschool. And he said, and now I have unrestricted time, and it's a big switch for me, but I'm being kind to myself about this. And actually, it was a very helpful tip for me to think about too. And then I move on to a scripture passage that might be helpful in reflecting on this particular area. And then some key themes or key words. For example, in talking about time, it is finding a rhythm to days and to seasons, I think, that's very important, because that's what is not being imposed upon us anymore. And that also brings a certain joy in terms of rhythm in life. A rhythm in life is a wonderful thing. Kathy was sharing before we began that she's doing a lot more in using song and being in a chorus and having time to do that. And the rhythm of music really comes to my mind in terms of thinking about rethinking our use of time. And then I identify a gift, which is a virtue or an attitude like self-compassion that might help us think about a challenge in this area, and a spiritual gift such as finding God in all things, and then end with a couple of reflection questions to mull over after you put the book down or that chapter down, at least. So that kind of gives you an overview. It's practical in terms of looking at structuring time, looking at meaning and purpose, and looking at not only finances, but possessions and place. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that overview from both of you. And Barbara, so glad you mentioned the Boston College course. I had the opportunity to facilitate your lovely course on retirement, and encourage any of you that are interested in taking that course. I think they'll be offering it again. But a lot of, I just remember a lot of people that were anticipating retirement talking about the financial concerns that they had. And you addressed that head on, so that was really good. I want to just, we got a couple things in the chat box already. A question for you, Bill. Do you talk about affirmative prayers, not just petition type prayers? And
Yes.
I think that's important. Yeah.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's, excuse me, that whole first section, when I talk about prayer, I talk about prayer, for example, praying with music, praying while walking in nature. I talk about praying just as part of, I even talk about, I think I use an example of making a gratitude list, and how you can make that list and how you can do it gradually. And then also, as you're doing it, you're going back over it daily and kind of reminding yourself of the things that you're grateful for. And also just talking about prayer in terms of conversation with God, when you don't necessarily have a particular petition, but you're just enjoying the relationship, so to speak. So yes, that's an important part of my whole first third of the book, of expanding your whole concept of ways to pray. One of the things I found as a spiritual director is that, excuse me, many people who come to me have what I would consider it's certainly not an invalid notion, but it's a somewhat limited notion of what prayer can be in their lives and in their relationship with God. And so one of my main things that I try to do with them always is to expand their notion of what prayer is and what prayer can be for them in their lives, and how prayer is really a significant way to build that relationship, that loving relationship with God, who is always inviting us to go deeper into the relationship. So
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's and that just, I think, is just kind of a underpinning to both of your books is, is that, yes, there's times of anxiety in our lives when we're getting ready to retire, but there is so much positivity as well. And to be, to really be affirming that and looking for that. And maybe as we age, we need to be more attentive to that. I read somewhere that for every 10 years of life, we smile less. And pretty sad.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You know, and it's so easy
It makes me frown. It makes me frown to hear that.
Yes. So we have a couple other things in the chat box. Barbara, you did put how to get access to that course, but you just sent it to the hosts and panelists. I wonder if you could put that up
okay.
for everybody.
There you go.
If there was a question about that. And then someone asked about the blog that you and I write, Still Blooming. And how can you tell us about your blog with Kathy and how that fits into your retirement journey and schedule? I wondered if you wanted to address that now or wait to talk about that. It doesn't really.
Sure. If you think this is a good time, yeah.
Yeah, I think that does fit nicely with your book. Yeah.
Let me just say, first of all, that I've been there to the blog and it's delightful. I really appreciate it. It's got lots of great information and lots of great, it really is another way to pray. So,
yes.
yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Well, I think it was the end of 2022. Kathy and I have a custom in our friendship of talking once a season at that point. And in the fall season, we had been chatting about several things that were coming up that had to do with how we were things that we were doing, how we were using our time, and the conversation was so rich. I think one of us just said we should have a blog, and so we decided after some discernment that we had the time and space, and maybe this was a good thing to do. So it's called Still Blooming. The address is there at stillblooming.blog. I think it'll be at the end. We call it Still Blooming because it is a reflection on things that are happening in the world and a view of life that we're developing as we move through our 70s and into the next decades. And sometimes we look forward, and sometimes we talk about the present, and sometimes we review the past. So the most current entry is about our grandmothers in honor of Mother's Day. And I talk about my maternal grandmother, and Kathy talks about her. It's your maternal grandmother too,
My maternal
right?
grandmother, yeah.
Yes, and just what they modeled for us and what we learned from them. And it's a kind of way of talking about accompaniment. And Bill, I think maybe that suggests something to reflect on, is who's accompanying us at this time of life. In your book, when you talk about relationships, I think that's so important. And when I talk about time, I talk about what does time have to do with the relationships that you want to shape and deepen, and including relationship with God, the relationship with creation as well as with others, and with society too. There's a whole lot of dimensions to relationship. So
that's right, Barbara. Not to interrupt, but just going back.
I'm finished.
Going back to what you're saying there, that whole concept of, God has designed. I mean, let's face it, God is the creator. What we see around us, all of that, both inanimate and animate, all of that is part of God's creation, and it's just so important. I think there are relationships that we can build with other people, with nature, in prayer, directly with they all point back to God. They all point back to the Trinity. It's very exciting in that sense. And that kind of leads me to just kind of in response to what you were saying about why you wrote your book and how it came to be. A couple of things occurred to me people would say to me, why this book and why now? Well, you know, one piece of this for me was that none of us are getting any younger. And some of us are actually past the big 7-0 now. I speak personally for myself here. And so I know that I'm going to use a little oxymoron here. It gets a little more, I get a little more of a sense of urgency about the fact that, you know, I'm not going to be in this life forever. I'm looking forward to the next life, but I'm not in any particular hurry to get there. However, I do feel like I'm a lot closer than I was 20 years ago. And the fact of the matter is, there is that sense that, are there things I would like to share before I move on? And one of the things that prompted me to write this book was, I realized that I couldn't have written this book 20 or 30 or 40 years ago because, number one, I wasn't retired. And number two, I wasn't old enough and wise enough. There's been a lot of learning that's happened over the course of life. And also, I hadn't learned from so many people, you know, the extra pieces that I've now come together with. So I guess there's that sense that that was a big piece of it for me. And another big piece is we all, and I treat this a little bit in the book too. There's a little bit of an idea of legacy, like what do we want to leave behind, or what do we want to pass on? And I like to think of it as a way of mentoring. You know, I have been mentored by so many wonderful people, and I would love, one of the greatest honors in my life is to be able to then say, here's what I've learned from my mentors, and give that to someone else, and allow it to speak to them in whatever way God intends for that to speak, and then they can pick it up from there. So that has a lot to do with why this book and why at this time.
Yes, and you know, in the very beginning of your book, you talk about when you, at the time of the writing, you've been retired for 10 years or hadn't worked full time for 10 years. So there is that wonderful perspective. And then Barbara, yours kind of looks more towards those that are planning or preparing in a sense.
Yes.
Would you say that's fair? Yeah, and I think both of you really do such a lovely job of speaking to that aspect of time, which is connected to legacy, you know, that we don't have unlimited time. Do you want to kind of address that? Like, what is that how can we claim our time that we have left? And are we a little bit more aware of that, or should we be more aware of that at this time in our lives?
You know, if you don't mind, Bill, if I could say something first.
Sure.
You know, one of the things I found with legacy is that so many people think of it in terms of finances and possessions. And I think that I began to rethink what legacy was when I started to think and hear from people, I'm not looking at what I'm doing, but who I want to become now. And what I do now is related to what I am becoming, the person God intended me to become. And I am leaving that as my legacy, you know? So, and I think that speaks very, well, say, for example, in looking back on Mother's Day, what have our mothers given us, or on Father's Day, what have our dads given us? I don't think we go to what was in the will. I think we go to sometimes with humor, you know, some kind of funny habit, but also some wonderful virtue or some wonderful attitude or an outlook on life that was shared that has sustained us. And And so I really like to broaden legacy to think about what we're doing, which contributes to who we are becoming, who we are intended to become, and that this becomes the memory that we're leaving people who will come after us.
Mhm.
I
That's
think
how
that's,
I'm thinking about it.
yeah, I think that's very well said. And I would concur wholeheartedly. I think that, and it's interesting because your booklet really, as I was reading through it, it occurred to me that it's structured in a really neat way to look at time, talent, and treasure. I think those
Oh,
three
is that interesting?
sections, yeah, those three sections of, because you talk about, you start out with treasure, that's the whole money piece, and you take a very, one of the things that I think is very similar about our two books is that I think they have a very similar underlying theology in them. And that's a theology of gratitude. It's a theology of inclusiveness in terms of creation, etc. And so when you're talking about treasure, you're talking about, as you said, not just how do I make sure I've got enough for me and enough for my children, but are there other things I want to do with that treasure? But then you move right from that into the whole idea of purpose. And that's where I think of the talent ideas of, how have I lived? What has been important to me in my life? How did I spend my career? And how has that moved forward? One of the most interesting things from my perspective about my retirement is I am doing things now that I was unable to do when I was working. And each of us has stories to tell about this. Kathy was sharing her story early on before the webinar started about singing in this choral group. She wasn't able to do that when she was working, and yet it's such a fulfilling thing for her and for those who get to listen. And it's the same thing now. For years, I wanted to be a spiritual director, and I was in spiritual direction for many years, and I just thought, I'd love to be able to kind of be in the other chair too, and now, having been doing that now for 10 years, I walked away from a session yesterday and I just said, thank you, God. I'm so happy I have time to do this now, because I know I was being called to do it, because I had such a beautiful session with this person yesterday, and God was so alive. The Spirit was so alive in the midst of that. The same thing with writing. Any writing that I did was very incremental and small. And yet when I was done, I always said, that was kind of fun. I think I'd like to do more of that. And so that's that piece. And then in your last section of your book, you talk beautifully about time management, in the sense of looking at all of this in terms of how do we spend our time in retirement. So it's I like the way you did that, and it fits really nicely into something we hear people talk about a lot, but you've given a little bit of a new spin to it. So thank you.
Someone just wrote into the chat, Debbie, that the favorite part of her stage of life is getting to daily mass. And Debbie, I really relate to that, not for myself, but especially for my mom. My mom organized her exercise because she walked to the church, her first social engagements of the day, because all her friends also went to daily mass, and then they went out afterward for coffee. The beginning of her giving thanks to God for the day. My mom really, I should say her name was Ann Radke. She had a name, not my mom. But I think I'm really relating to that. And also you're reminding me that my mother taught me that was one way to, one thing to really look for or to do. So thanks for your comment, Debbie.
I'm going to flip it a little bit too, because that's kind of the freedom that we have in retirement to choose some things that we weren't able to do before. For me, just joining the Notables, this local group here. But there's also, this is also a time of limitations, facing our limitations. And a question for both of you. Is there a benefit to having limitations in our lives at this time during retirement?
I'm going to extrovert a little bit here since I'm an extrovert. I'm going to kind of jump right in and just mention that I think that, first of all, I'm glad you raised that issue, Kathy, because I want to point out that I think in the case of both what Barbara wrote and what I wrote, there's certainly not, it's not all sunshine and roses. And it's really important to recognize that. And there are certainly issues that we deal with more in this period of our lives, probably, than we have earlier on, whether those are physical ailments, mental, psychological, whatever, or whether it's, family situations that develop that because we may have another generation or two that has followed us, and then they have things they're dealing with. So naturally, we're dealing with those too. And also that whole concept of looking at, are there broken relationships that we really want to work with, and they're causing us pain, etc. And I think that part of my approach to that aspect of things is I like to think that, from my own perspective, I like to think that God doesn't necessarily wish us to suffer, but God knows that suffering is a part of life. And oftentimes that suffering comes, just looking at that whole forgiveness piece for a minute, oftentimes our suffering comes from something someone else has done to us, and it may be some way that we were injured physically or emotionally or whatever. But in that suffering, God is always with us. And there are ways we can grow through sufferings, through enduring suffering in a spiritual way, working with God during that time. And there are things we can learn that we're not necessarily going to learn in other ways. Not to overdo this, but I have to go back to the whole anonymous movement again, just to say, one of the things they say in that movement is the person who is best equipped to help an alcoholic or somebody who is, an overeater, or in Narcotics Anonymous or whatever anonymous group it is. The person who can best help that person is someone who has suffered in a similar way, someone who has been there, because they have understandings and abilities and ways to communicate that no one else has. And one of the things that I think is very significant, looking at relationships again for a moment, is that in our living, we have opportunities to relate to so many people. And each one of us has equipment, if you will, by the stories we have, the experiences we've lived, that are unique to us, but that also have something to do with someone else's story. When we find those people, we can give help. So that's a long answer to the question. And I'm hoping too that I've given Barbara some time. I know she's going to have lots of things to say too. So anyway, I'm just going to pass the torch on to Barbara here.
Bill knows I'm an introvert. You know what I think the best way to answer that question, Kathy, is like really to share something personal, which is, my mobility has been severely restricted in the last 5 or 6 years. And so I was a big traveler at one point, and traveled to Asia and all through Europe and parts of Africa, and now the world is not my palette anymore. It's very difficult for me to do. And I really faced that also in my family, because I was often a first responder when something happened. And I learned through an episode in my family and somebody really needing help that I couldn't respond immediately and be a first responder. It was more of a liability to do that.
Yeah.
And so, um, I think then what I'm faced with is a kind of question about what does that mean about me and how I think about myself. And so I could have stayed with that image of me of being a liability and having a very small world. Or I could have said the agility that I had in my body, God has given me in my mind. And how do I reimagine that?
Mhm.
So that I can find the hidden wholeness of things much closer to me and relate in these family emergencies in a way that can be supportive and not burdensome.
Mhm.
And I think that there's Bill talks about creativity. I talk about creativity in the book. I think agility may be a new virtue that we need to talk about in terms of such troubled times and really fast change. And that's how I am dealing with the obvious decline that comes from age and the challenges that we have. And also that we don't have to do that all by ourselves. As Bill talks about the partners that can accompany us, we have partners too, and we have to create that community by being humble enough to share that I just can't do it the same way I used to do it. And
Yeah.
help me find a way that I can still be myself and participate. Well, there you
Well
go.
said. Well said.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And both of you have spoken to that so eloquently that there is, and to me, the spiritual component in both of your books and your approach to this topic is that we are, number one, that term accompaniment. God accompanies us in a different way, and we can find people to accompany us, so that we don't end up, immersed in regret and remorse, but can make peace with some of the limitations in our lives, as well as loss. I was struck with the term, your emphasis on relationships, Bill, and this is a time of loss in our lives too, where we're losing people we love. I have lost 4 of my 5 siblings within an 18-month period. And it's a deep, deep loss in my life to have all of my sisters gone and one of my brothers. And it's kind of like coming to terms with that. How do I learn to be accompanied by God in that loss? We had a lovely comment here from John, who says, who serves as a hospital chaplain, and I see suffering and death of people my own age. It's given me a new way of looking at my own aging process in my late 60s, a gentler compassion. And isn't that a lovely way to put it? A gentler compassion towards others, certainly, but towards ourselves. And,
that's beautiful.
yeah.
And, if I may piggyback on that for just a moment, one of the other driving forces for this topic, for why this topic of retirement, of aging, of this part of life is so important, I think, is because it's an opportunity to continue to be mentored by those who are in similar circumstances and can relate to us with some aspect of our struggle, but also it's an opportunity for us to continue to mentor those. And again, you see this relationship thing, this whole intertwining going on here with this. It's no accident that many cultures, more so than our culture right now, at least, many cultures really still revere those who are old. those who are older, those who are in the
Mm.
latter part of their life. Even in some of the cultures where this whole idea of youth being the height of living or whatever, even in cultures where more of that is happening, you still find, for example, in Japan, just to use an example, elderly people, the eldest generation in a family is still very much revered. And while there is some of that in our culture, there's a lot of temptation to be focused on youth. And while I have nothing against youth, I mean, I was young once myself too, and I loved it, I have nothing against youth, but we let's put it this way, we risk we ignore the elderly and the wisdom of the elderly at our own risk, because there's so much to be given to us in this time of life, and God helps us with that. So
Yeah. Barbara, a question kind of came up around your reference to legacy. Do you ever struggle with trying to figure out what is God's will?
Yes. And
Short answer.
definitely. I think that's, and I bring that to prayer. I bring that to silence. I bring that to, I don't have a spiritual director right at the moment, but when I did, I would discuss it with a spiritual director. I bring it to valued community of friends and family, and just wait on it. I come from having worked in a Jesuit institution, and they're being very generous and sharing anything we wanted to learn about Ignatian spirituality. So the whole process of discernment, I think, comes to me from the Saint Ignatius, and what and it also means that just have to be patient and live with ambiguity. I think there's a lot of living with ambiguity when you're older.
Yes.
And life isn't always really clear. And so, yeah, thank you for that question, because it's a good one. Maybe Bill and Kathy, you both are spiritual directors. You would have something else to offer, but I wouldn't want to make it sound like it was really clear all the time.
well, the first thing I would say, Barbara, is that what you mentioned about the whole Ignatian process of discernment is just, that has helped me so much over the years. My own spiritual director introduced me to that, and then I, learned more about it over the years so that I could be a little better at working with other people with that. But I think that, to me, has really helped me in terms of understanding a system or a process that will help me get to a point, in discernment where I feel like I know kind of how God would like to see me moving. And I think another piece to that, which goes back to the initial question, is that one of the things I try to help my directees understand is that God does not, it's not like God is looking to grade us and say, okay, you did exactly what I wanted you to do. Or it's like God is so immersed in our journeys. And as long as we're working that process of discernment the best we can, we can't make a mistake, so to speak. In other words, we come to through prayer, discernment, weighing the pros and cons, talking with wise people, et cetera, we come to a decision process, and it's like God, that's what God wants us to do. And then whatever we decide, God will be with us in that and will help us move forward in a good way. One time, I'll never forget, one time I was working with a group of college students, and we were talking about this whole thing. And I had a young man come up to me and say to me, I'm a senior in college now, and I'm an accounting major. And for all of the 4 years, I've been worried that, okay, am I supposed to be in accounting? Am I supposed to be in accounting? Maybe. And now I feel like if I do accounting for a little while and it doesn't turn out the way I thought, God's not going to be angry with me. I will move to something else. And so he says, I just feel a freedom now. I don't feel like I'm walled in by only having one choice and not being able to figure out what that choice is. And I think there's a lot of freedom in knowing that God really loves seeing us move forward with decisions and will help us no matter what we decide.
As we're getting close to the end, I have one more question, and that's when you mentioned gratitude. I think both of you are very keen on that the older we get, the more we have to be focused on that and gratitude. And Brother Sendell Ross says that a key component to being grateful is being open to surprise. So my final question for both of you is, what has surprised you about retirement?
How much time do we have?
That it's a movable feast.
Oh,
No, if you're going to use the image of feast, that it changes all the time.
Yeah.
And that's part of that agility also of going with the change that it brings.
yeah.
And I would also add to that the importance of the immediacy of the present. What we have now, we're never gonna recapture and relive the past. It's important to remember it and to bring it forward. The future can be unknown, but the present is here, and we really need to immerse ourselves in it and be alert. As Bernard Lonergan said, that's the first step, is to be alert.
Oh.
And that comes back to me almost every day.
I think that's wonderful, because that just really prompts a thought in my mind. Living in the moment is so incredibly important at any time of life. And I think it's just as, or even more important at this time, because Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk who was a very good friend of Thomas Merton's, and one of the things they used to talk about was living in the moment. And of course, Buddhists are very anti-multitasking, because multitasking is too distracting. It's kind of like, if you're eating a bowl of cereal, enjoy the bowl of cereal. And that's a simplistic but a very powerful example. And I think that living in the moment and paying attention to the moment is critical. And I think the thing that came to my mind as a first response to Kathy's question was, the thing that surprises me the most in my retirement is something that I still have to work on. And that is being so busy. My wife has this great saying, which she tells to people. She says, especially people who are getting ready for retirement, she says, when you get ready for retirement, first of all, buy a bigger calendar. She said, because there are going to be so many things that you're going to want to do. And one of the things that we don't have time to get into here is the whole concept of being as opposed to just doing.
Yes.
Now, so it's important, I would say, to remember that retirement is a time for reflection and for being, and your doing should come out of taking time to be, and just really working on that relationship with God from a listening perspective.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. We could go on for a few more hours, because there's so many more questions that I know I have, I think our participants, but we are running out of time. I want to thank both of you. Your insights, your writing, your persona, your beings are such a gift. Here is some, Barbara and Bill both been very generous in sharing their contact information. So here's their email addresses. Barbara, my blog and my blog are still blooming. You can, we invite you very much to go there and join in conversation with us. We're always asking our readers to add something to that, and you can find out more about Barbara's work there as well. And then Bill does have a website, findingspiritualdirection.com, so be sure to visit that as well. So again,
I'm sorry to
I want
interrupt.
to thank you. Oh,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Kathy. Just one quick line about my website is that a friend of mine and I, about a little over 2 years ago, we started doing weekly reflections on the Sunday scriptures. And you can go there, and we've got about 2 years worth of them now, including up until this coming Sunday. So I love to drive people to that, just so it doesn't cost you anything. It's nothing. It's just something we do to kind of share the word. It's a little bit like your blog. In other words, there's a blog as part of that. And I just wanted to encourage people to take a look at that. I'd love for you to see what we're doing.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. Well, thank you both. And thanks to all of you for being participants. And I'll just turn this over to Dan real quick to share a few additional resources from 23rd, because this is such an important topic, retirement, but also, you know, our wonderful resources for seniors. So thank you all for being part of us. And Dan, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Kathy. And to take off from the theme of gratitude that Bill mentioned early on, Barbara, thank you. Bill, thank you both for your warm words. You both have such a warm presence and really beautiful things to say. I just shared a link. You can find Bill's book, Barbara's book, and Sister Janet's book that Kathy mentioned earlier on our senior inspiration page at 23rd Publications. Just wanted to also mention we'll be hosting additional webinars. Oops, did I go off? We'll be hosting additional webinars this year. We definitely have one planned on October 17th on the topic of grief. But we'll alert you all then. We'll probably send out a note about the recording to all the attendees, but the recording of today's webinar will be available on the product pages of Bill's book and Barbara's book. So again, thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it.